what we're doing with CWD management is trying to overcome the force of infection. And that really is the frequency of the population is becoming infected in a new year, right? And removing more deer than can be infected. So it becomes a proportions game. And so really the goal is to remove enough fast enough that you don't allow spread to continue.
What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Druryoutdoors 100% Wild podcast, brought to you by DeerCast. You're listening to the voice of Tim Chelsvik.
The smooth jams of Tim Chelsvik. This is Matt Drury, the co-host. They can't get rid of me because my last name is Drury, and I've been told. Why? Yeah, that's why I'm here still. I've been told I don't know how to brush hog. That was the latest comment on one of the videos this week.
Just add it to the list of things you can't do.
Can't do right.
Yeah, poor Matt.
That's all right.
Hey,
he can suck it, because when I kill a deer there, I'm gonna. Hey, the guy that said I can't brush hog, this one's for you.
Even the guy who can't think says something. Jeez. Well, so we're going to be talking about conservation. We're going to be talking about whitetails, and we're going to be talking about CWD this episode.
Yep.
And generally, people consider us as kind of the end-all, be-all authorities and credibility.
Something like that.
In the whitetail world, we understand that, but we thought we would kind of augment our knowledge and our credibility this morning
with someone that has some.
Yeah. So we have from the Missouri Department of Conservation, we have Jason Isabelle. He's the Cervid program supervisor. So Jason, good morning,
guys.
Good morning.
And then we have another Jason Sumners, who is actually the 10th director of the Missouri Department of Conservation.
Big deal.
Recently installed.
Jason, how's it going?
It's going great. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate the comments that you're receiving there, Matt. It feels much like the same kind of comments that Jason and I get about management decisions.
That's right.
You're in good company.
No matter what you're doing, I can assure you it's wrong. Just look online.
You've got to have a thick skin. You know, I spend quite a bit of time at a lot of our conservation areas that are managed by the MDC. And it's a great reminder for me as a dyed-in-the-wool bow hunter that not only the MDC, but other states have DNRs. They have to manage these properties for the interests of a wide spectrum of people. As bow hunters and deer hunters, we kind of have this narrow lane of this is what we want and this is how we want it. Screw the bird watchers, screw the backpacker. But there's a wide range of interests that these wildlife agencies have to manage for.
And not easy. How do you guys even try to attempt to cover, what's best for the northern part of the state versus the central or the southern part of the state? How do you even try to attempt to tackle that problem from species to species?
Yeah, that's a great question. We own and manage over 1,000 areas and accesses, and it totals more than 1 million acres. And it ranges, from nature centers to intensively managed wetlands. So, yeah, as you can imagine, public use is always one of those very, very challenging topics. And I think that's where, our local staff are the ones that are really tuned in to knowing who's using those areas and how they try to best accommodate the various uses. And then there's also just, kind of extensive planning processes that we go through and basically say, what's the biggest public use as well as the most important, resource related use, and then recognize you can't do everything everywhere. And so, yeah, it can be pretty challenging at times, especially because you recognize folks grow a very strong attachment to those places. And when you in a grassland area and you go push out the tree that somebody would have wanted to have built a tree stand in, put a tree stand up in, it can be challenging. And we don't necessarily always win a lot of friends in some of those situations. But the flip side of that is folks that go to our areas are going to have a pretty good experience in terms of the management efforts that put forth trying to make those areas everything that we can.
Can we just identify the elephant in the room right now?
Well, let's do it.
And that last time, Jason Sumners, you were on, you were not the director of the Missouri Department of Conservation.
And now you are. So I don't want to draw a direct line from
I wouldn't do that. No.
The popularity that you have received from joining us on this podcast.
Audience.
But we also had this conversation with Mike Kehoe before he won the primary. So
time will tell.
We're not batting 1,000, but we're doing pretty well here.
Yeah.
Jason, would you like to comment on this?
Well, yeah, I remember the very awkward question Tim asked me towards the end of that interview. The commissioner
Which
was
one?
They're
all
in the
awkward.
deliberation process. So yeah, no, I appreciate all of the support from you and quite frankly from a lot of folks in the conservation community across the state. I'm truly humbled to be serving in this role.
Well,
that sounds like an endorsement of us.
Of the podcast.
I mean, a tacit endorsement, but an endorsement nonetheless. That's
actually, could you just give us some sort of soundbite from start to finish that we could cut that says we got you this position?
Dear Matt and Tim, thank you for my career. Love Jason Sumners.
Matt's hunting for a compliment however he can get it. He's really hurt over the brush hogging comment, isn't he?
Yes, I am. I mean, there's a good chance I may have been doing it wrong. I really don't know. Nobody taught me.
We're not good. We need all the help that we can get.
I mean, I didn't think you could mess that up, but maybe I have been. All right. So now that we've buttered you two up, we're going to just cut right to it and we're going to chop you down one piece at a time like the audience wants us to do. So, all right. I looked it up. We had the MDC on. It was 6 years ago. It was July 25th, 2018. It was episode 71. Jason was with us. Dr. Grant Woods joined us. Mark and Terry were on. And I think Barb Keller was on with us. So this was a ways back there. And, I just thought it'd be a great episode to, 6 years later, where are we at? What's the update? What's the progress? Because MDC is great about putting out the numbers, and anybody can go Google it and look up, how effective you guys have been in CWD mitigation and what's going on, what efforts you're going through. But I thought, why don't we just have you guys on and hear it straight from the horse's mouth? So where are we at today, 2024, as we sit compared to 6 years ago, basically the same time period here?
Yeah, so I think in terms of where we are in Missouri, we've certainly detected CWD in a number of counties since then. But I think if you look at the number of deer that are testing positive for the disease in Missouri is still very low. I think that's certainly a testament to our aggressive management actions. And so even in the areas of the state where we've had the disease the longest, we've adhered to some aggressive localized management in addition to some broad scale management effort to complement that localized management. And we continue to find in the areas where we've had the disease the longest, a relatively small percentage of that deer population that's testing positive for the disease. Okay.
So as I looked it up, and just like I said, anybody can Google this stuff and do the very basic research that you guys, the numbers that you guys put out. So just in 2023 alone, it looked like there was out of 37,000 whitetails that were tested, you guys had 162 that were positive. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. So sub 1% prevalence at the statewide scale. And then even in what we call our CWD core areas, which are areas that are within about 2 miles roughly of where we've had positive detections. If we look at the number of deer at that localized level, still right around just 1%. So very low levels of disease, even at that localized scale, right where we've had previous detections.
So what would you say to someone that says, well, it sounds like it's a solution that's looking for a problem in terms of the culling that's happening? Like if the prevalence is so low, then why are we doing these sometimes in some cases drastic kill-offs?
So the best time to act in terms of your chances of success managing CWD is as early as possible. So we know from what we've seen in some other states in terms of the trajectory of the disease that once you hit 3 to 5% of the population infected, you see rapidly rising infection rates. And it does not take long to go from sub 5% levels, sub 10% levels to, in some cases, in terms of bucks, over 50% prevalence in just a matter of a couple decades. So once you hit that critical point, that inflection point in the graph, things really take off. And so, like I said, the best time to act is early. We have low infection rates. That's why we are managing so aggressively, because we can be successful at those low infection rates. And it takes that intensive management to keep those rates as low as possible so that they do not hit that inflection point and really accelerate.
Do you foresee that being kind of a long-term, that this is just our new normal, is doing this type of culling and some of the prohibitions against mineral and supplemental feeding outside the season?
Yes, I mean, based on the successes we've had, and we've always characterized CWD management as a marathon and not a sprint. And so just looking long-term and sustaining those efforts is going to continue to be critically important in those areas. You know, obviously, it becomes more challenging as you detect the disease in different areas, and you have to, your management efforts can get spread a little bit more thin as you try to implement those management strategies in different places. And so we're going to have continue to be adaptive and creative in our approach as the dynamics of the disease change and the locations change, but adhering to the successes that we've had and continuing to be aggressive and continuing to work with landowners in those localized areas will be critical.
So Jason, go ahead, Jason Sumners.
Well, yeah, I was going to jump in because I think where we are is many of the actions we've taken to date, you know, whether that in states have taken are, you know, really oriented towards a couple of things. One is trying to prevent the disease from getting there, right? So things like carcass movement restrictions, things like, you know, the movement of confined cervids, those things that would introduce the disease to a new place. It was where we really, you know, the last 20 years have been spent. We know that's probably helped, right? But we've still had the disease introduced. And so we really are shifting a lot of the conversations into, now that the disease is present in a number of places, how do we minimize it getting everywhere? But then how do we start to manage a deer population that has CWD, right? Instead of making CWD this giant villain, which it is, it's a nasty disease that has no doubt, you know, significant impacts to our population. But moving forward, what tools do we have available to us, right? These other regulation changes were, again, trying to minimize and prevent the initial establishment. Now that's here and established, where do we move forward and what does that look like is the questions many of us are now asking.
Yeah, we should back up real quick for any audience members that don't know what CWD is, and I should have started out this way. Jason, Isabelle, could you give us a description of what CWD is, how it affects the nervous system, and what typically will happen to a whitetail when they get it?
Yeah, so it's 100% fatal, contagious, infectious disease of deer and other members of the deer family. The infectious agent, interestingly, it's a misfolded protein. So we tend to think of diseases as being caused by bacteria or viruses or parasites, but this is an interesting disease. It is a misfolded protein. And so it's, like I said, 100% fatal. It can be transmitted from deer to deer through direct contact or through a deer coming into contact with those misfolded proteins that have been enter the environment from an infected deer. And so the way the disease progresses, there's a delayed incubation period. So for most deer that have CWD, you're looking at anywhere from 18 months to 2 years before they start to show clinical symptoms. And so as the misfolded proteins get in the body of the deer, what they do is they make other prions misfold, and there starts a chain reaction in the deer. And slowly those misfolded proteins accumulate in the brain and central nervous system of the deer. And so during that delayed incubation period, those infectious prions are building up in the central nervous system in the brain and causing damage to the brain slowly through time. Ultimately, all deer that have CWD will die from it. But there is that delayed period before you see those clinical symptoms. So often, you know, most of the deer that hunters harvest that test positive for CWD look perfectly healthy. But they're in that, if they test positive, they're just in that delayed incubation period before clinical symptoms actually occur in the deer. And once the clinical symptoms occur, death usually occurs pretty rapidly after that, as that degeneration of the brain causes, you know, the symptoms that we typically see: emaciation, head down, salivation, ears drooped. I mean, that at the later stages, there's been so much damage to the brain of the deer that it causes all sorts of issues and ultimately results in their death.
Can you, I don't know if anyone's done a CT scan or any kind of scan of a whitetail brain after it's succumbed to CWD, but if you have, does it look any different in a scan like that?
Yeah, it's got a bunch of holes. So it's a spongiform encephalopathy. And so if you look at hence the name spongiform, it essentially kills neurons and makes holes in the brain.
So one of the things that you often read or see online from chat sites or on Facebook groups or whatever is like, I've never seen a deer, sick with CWD. You always hear of EHD deer, and EHD deer, it seems like they have similar types of issues that they're dealing with, and kind of head towards water, their heads down, they're kind of lethargic. What would you say to the detractors that are saying like, hey, you never see anybody that has actually seen a CWD deer or heard of anybody that sees an actual CWD deer in the wild? What would you say to that? Because I assume you guys have known cases of this, right?
It's a numbers game, fellas. It's a numbers game at this point. And so we're talking about 1 or 2% of our deer inside of the areas where we know the disease exists, likely have the disease. And so there's deer die of a lot of things on an annual basis. And so at this point, it's relatively low. Now, if you live in one of those places where prevalence rate in adult bucks is 40 to 50%, they are absolutely, without a doubt, seeing sick deer on the landscape, and wandering into people's yards and getting shot. And so that's mostly a result of the distribution and then the frequency of it. The other interesting thing that's starting to come out with some of these collaring studies is the time in which that mortality occurs. So they're seeing in Wisconsin a lot of that mortality occurring in late winter, right? That real intense stress period. There aren't a lot of people out wandering around in late winter, right? And the same is starting to reveal itself in Arkansas. Some of the stuff they're finding is the real heat stress period, right? So these animals are really resilient. As long as they can eat and kind of find a way to forage, they can figure out a way to survive. But it appears those heat stress periods in late summer in Arkansas are actually kind of a time frame in which they're getting, their infected deer dying. So part of that again, and so that's a time in which there aren't a ton of people out and about in the woods in the late summer period. So there's these cofactors, but part of it, EHD, those deer become extremely visible. They go to places. I think a lot of these CWD infected deer are just kind of wandering off and laying down, and it's a more slowly progressing thing.
Because you definitely,
and I'll add to that too, because it's something we get a lot of confusion about with hunters in terms of hemorrhagic disease versus CWD. If you think about hemorrhagic disease, it's a virus that causes rapid mortality. I mean, generally, the deer that are getting HD gets transmitted by a biting midge fly, causes fever, internal hemorrhaging, and then they're dead within a week. And it can happen synchronously. So you're having, especially in a drought year, you can have lots of deer that die very quickly, very visible out by folks' ponds and the creeks. And so hunters see that and then wonder why they're not seeing deer die like that from CWD. But if you think about how I explained that process works with that delayed incubation period, during that entire 18 months, 2-year period where the disease is slowly progressing within the deer's body, it's losing its ability to behave like it normally would. And so deer that have CWD are more likely to be shot by a hunter, hit by a vehicle, killed by a coyote or other predator. And so you're not going to see that level of elevated mortality in a synchronous nature like you will HD. So and Jason mentioned the radio collaring studies. So they've collared deer where they did not detect CWD and collared deer that ended up testing positive, and looked at the annual survival rates of those two types of deer. And survival rates of the deer that had CWD were 3 times lower than they were in the deer that CWD was not detected. And so it's important just to think about, when you think about HD versus CWD, 2 entirely different diseases that affect deer and deer populations in 2 very different ways. It's really difficult to draw parallels between the 2 because they are so different.
Sounds like there's almost a natural selection happening with these deer that are infected being taken out by hunters or just making poor decisions because they're compromised.
Well, I think the issue from a public perspective is they see the EHD die-offs happen every couple of years. It feels like we'll see them come through, and if it hits your area, it's a massive die-off, right? And so it's what's in front of our faces the most. It's like, how come we can't dedicate, research and money and funds towards fixing this issue versus CWD when it's, a sub 1% mortality rate or whatever you had said that was. I mean, it seems like this is in front of us. So this is the issue that people would want us to focus on versus this kind of
EHD
silent
versus CWD.
EHD versus CWD, which is like CWD is kind of the silent, invisible killer that we hear a lot about, we hear the most about, but yet we don't as hunters, and I hear what you're saying, like, hey, people aren't in the woods this time of year, that time of year, but as well as I do, outdoorsmen, they're outdoors a lot, no matter what the conditions are. So, or even farmers or whatever. So they're like, I see this EHD, I don't see that CWD. And so it's almost like just a line in the sand that's drawn. What would you say to that as far as funds and what can happen to the herd with CWD versus what is happening to the herd with EHD when it hits?
I think this is about the long-term resilience of the whitetail deer and the populations, right? We've had the presence of EHD on the landscape for at least 150 years, as best we can tell. In the late 1800s was some of the first early indications of what probably was the emergence of hemorrhagic diseases in North America. And we know that, to your point, Tim, there's some antibodies that get built up. There's resistance that can be passed on. We know that they fluctuate, right? We'll have booms and busts, and part of that's the changes in antibodies. Populations recover pretty quickly from EHD. And so it really, from a broad herd health standpoint, really isn't impacting it. What CWD is this long-term mortality factor that is a slow drip and a slow drain on the population that is absolutely impacting the quality of the health and of the herd at large, right? Just the same ways that habitat impacts, right? If habitat gets degraded, we know that, it can only, the ecosystem can only sustain so many deer on a landscape, right? So these are all those things that really impact the health of the herd. EHD affects the number of deer you see on any given day, but we know reproductive rates are going to stay high. Survival is going to stay relatively high on an annual basis. And so they bounce back in 3 to 5 years. What we're talking about with CWD is the introduction of something that is going to perpetually be a slow drain on the population, going to impact the ability of deer to survive to older ages. And as a result, reduce the reproductive potential of these populations because they are younger and there are fewer individuals. And so that's what, the real challenge is to communicate how these two things at the end of the day result in you seeing something different. I don't know how we get through on that one, but they just operate very, very differently.
So do you guys, and I know that you do communicate with the other states and DNR agencies and there's committees that are formed regarding this stuff for studies and all types of stuff. So have there been any of those states that were early on, out west or, Wisconsin, Wyoming, South Dakota, any of those ones that you heard of early on? Because I remember doing stories about this on Wildlife Obsession back in the early 2000s where we touched on this. What and I feel like it was Wyoming or South Dakota. I don't remember. It was a mule deer population. Are there any studies now, 20 years later, that you guys can point to or say, hey, yeah, this, maybe we didn't know what it was back then as a whitetail community or the Cervid community, and we didn't get aggressive with it. And here's this landscape now with, a population that just got decimated because of it. Is there something that you guys can point to or look towards as, hey, this is the worst case? Cautionary tale.
Yeah, I think as you start to look at some of the areas in, Wyoming and Colorado that have had the disease for a long time now, you're starting to see some long-term pretty precipitous declines in whitetail muley and elk populations. attributed to CWD, and starting to see some changes in the age structure of those herds too. I mean, once you have high enough infection rates of the disease that animals are getting it as fawns or yearlings, and you've got a 1.5 2 year incubation period, it stands to reason that you're not going to have a whole lot of 4, 5, 6+ year old individuals in the population. So starting to see the age structure affected, starting to see population size affected. And the scary thing about CWD, unlike hemorrhagic diseases, there's no indications that those populations are going to recover from CWD. Whereas we have HD, we can pretty predictably predict that population is going to bounce back in just a few years. Not the case with CWD. So yeah, I think some of what we're seeing out west is extremely concerning. And we're also seeing some pretty high infection rates in some Midwestern and Eastern populations of whitetails as well. So it'd be interesting to see in some of those cases in the Midwest and in the Northeast what we're going to see in the next few years, because some of the infection rates in those populations are getting really, really high as well.
For the person that has a deer tested this season and it comes back positive, what is the current guidance on that? Do you eat it? Do you what do you do?
Yeah, so we defer to the CDC in that case, and their recommendation is, even though there's never been a human case of CWD, to not consume a deer that's tested positive for the disease.
Sure.
So in a state, I'm just trying to draw some other comparisons here. So one of the things to help mitigate CWD positives in Missouri has been, counties that are adjacent to it. There would be a ban on supplemental feeding or attractants, minerals, what have you. Are there states such as, say, Illinois, that's right next door here, where they've never allowed attractants or minerals or anything like that? What's their CWD situation like versus ours in the form of, has that helped slow the spread down? Are there studies? And likewise, the states that allow, baiting, what's it like in those states as far as the spread of it? Are there any correlations there?
Yeah, it's challenging to pick apart the different regulations and try to attribute the differences in spread based on one or two regulations. Often what you'll see is states will implement a suite of regulation change, whether it's carcass movement restrictions or feeding bans or changes to, bag limits. I mean, there's usually a number of changes that get made at the state level. So it's really hard to tease apart the effects of those rather broad scale regulation changes. What we do know from several peer reviewed research projects in terms of localized management is that, targeted removal, going into areas where you've detected the disease and removing deer in those localized areas certainly helps to slow the spread of the disease, both by removing positive individuals from the landscape and also lowering deer density in those areas and minimizing transmission in that way. And that's the strategy that we've used here in Missouri since we detected the disease. And so really, if you think about CWD regulations, and Jason touched on this earlier, they often will occur at a couple different spatial scales. One, you'll have them occur at the county level or deer management unit level, kind of the broad scale carcass movement restrictions, feeding bans. And then you will often see in some states a localized strategy, which occurs much closer to the areas of detection.
So on that localized strategy, that's a real hot topic for people. I know in my county where I grew up, St. Genevieve County, I saw the stats of last year's positives. They had like 31 positives, which was way more. It seemed like way more than any other county. And the local, hunter population down there is really upset with the mitigation and how that's going and just kind of killing off the entire, what seems like, hey, we're just going in and trying to kill out the entire herd, especially, after 20, 30, 40 years of them trying to get it to where they're managing and several people are on that like wavelength of, let's pass up the younger deer and grow a little bit more of a age structure behind it. And now we're going out and wiping the deer herd. It's seemingly, wiping the deer herd out here. So the mitigation side of it, can you dive into that a little bit further and what kind of, positive attributes, what kind of pushback, like dive into that aspect of CWD a little bit more for me.
Yeah. So in terms of the localized management, it's really, when we talked previously about the long term and trying to look long term at what's best for the deer population. And so within those, just to talk a little bit more about targeted removal. So those occur within about 2 miles of where we had positive detections. It only occurs with landowner permission. So it occurs from right after our tree season ends, starts on January 16th and runs through the 15th of March. And so with landowner permission, either our staff or the landowners themselves with authorization from us go in and remove additional deer. And again, the objectives there are to remove additional positives and to lower deer density in those localized areas to reduce the spread of the disease. And so we have a lot of landowner support, but we do have some, as you mentioned, that do not support those efforts. And so I think that the important thing to think about is those management efforts are taking place because we feel that's in the long-term best interest of the deer population. So we're lowering the deer density, removing additional positives is certainly what's best for that population because it's going to slow the spread of the disease. And so even though that's counter to what some hunters and landowners may desire in the immediate, currently in the immediate presence, but in the future, in the long term, if we look, what do we want our deer population to look like in 10, 20, 30, 40 plus years? Those management efforts are really critical to slowing the spread and keeping it below that level where the disease is really going to accelerate and increase in the population.
A couple
so
points.
Matt, I think St. John's an interesting case study. I remember back days when I was the deer biologist, is one of the places we had the highest hunter density, right? And so I think it's back to that Jason was talking about, trying to figure out the patterns and trends of regulations, and it's sort of the context in which all of this occurs. There's a place where I remember we implemented the antler point restriction there, and the population was at a state and the hunter density was at a state where it actually had a very negative impact on the population. We were driving the population down by the antler point restriction, forcing folks to shoot an antlerless deer before they shot an antler deer, and in a place where we had tremendously high hunter densities, right? So overall, I think it was a place too where deer densities were relatively low. The pattern of distribution of positives in St. John County would also suggest that it was likely introduced there quite a bit earlier than we would have thought, right? It may have been introduced before some of the other locations that we have based on that broad distribution. But we don't have a lot of positives. So spread may have been occurring, but the fact that we had relatively low densities, we had high hunter pressure, had high harvest pressure on the population, probably has resulted in us keeping prevalence rates lower. So that doesn't occur across the state or across the country, right? The hunter distribution, deer population sizes look different. The sex ratio and the demographics of the population look different based on hunter densities and habitat condition and all those things. And so then you throw CWD into it, that mix, and it's going to react differently on the landscape, and the pattern's going to look different. Mm-hmm. But I do think St. John is, again, one of those really interesting little case studies because all the data would suggest that the disease probably was there a little bit longer than some of our others. But I also, too, do wonder, the reality that deer densities in St. John are probably much lower than what they would have been had it been introduced, some much longer time in a more northern Missouri county where densities might have been higher, right? So would that pattern of spread look different? So this is really the parts we're trying to tease out now, and it's going to involve multiple states in terms of trying to look at all these cofactors around harvest regulations and deer density and hunter preferences and what does a deer population need to look like from a broad scale as we move forward, recognizing that composition of the herd absolutely impacts the way the disease is going to spread through the population.
Well, that's kind of what I was going to ask is like, what number do you guys what number do you want the deer population in a certain county to get down to feel like it's the task has been completed? It's never done. I'm sure it's never finished, but like, what does success look like? Because it doesn't it still live in the soil? Do we know how long it stays in the soil and can still be transmitted? I'm just thinking, like, if the population's gone, first of all, how long does it take for the population to bounce back? And then second, if they do bounce back, can they still get it from the soil that, was contaminated 20 years ago or whatever the case may be?
And I think if you think about deer populations, in those areas, I mean, we know certainly it persists in the soil and probably for several years at least. And so that obviously is an issue once you have high infection rates and you can have the potential for high environmental transmission. But that's, again, going back to our discussion earlier, why it's important to actively manage the disease early is if you actively manage the disease early, you've got less environmental transmission occurring, right? The disease hasn't been there that long. You catch it early, you're removing additional deer in those areas. There's less infectious prions in the soil. But when the trouble is, once you get prevalence rates that they get to high levels, obviously you have more deer with the disease. You've got more disease entering the soil from those infected deer. And at that point in time, management becomes extremely challenging. So our goal in those localized areas is to remove additional deer on top of what hunters would remove during the deer hunting season. We have specific goals for each one of the core areas that we conduct targeted removal in. And again, just to lower those deer populations in those localized areas. It's not trying to eliminate all deer in those areas. It's trying to reduce deer density and trying to work with hunters and landowners and to recognize that the lower deer numbers in those areas, although that be less desirable if you're out there deer hunting, just thinking long term, what do you want that deer population to look like in the long term? Because we know from observing some trends in other states that if we do not aggressively manage the disease, yes, you may have more deer in the short term, but longer term, you're going to have higher infection rates and ultimately probably get to a level of disease that causes a population decline, a younger population with less older deer. And based on what we've seen in other states thus far, no indications that populations will recover from that.
Yeah. Well, the deal here, I don't know, is necessarily density. We talk about density, but really what we're doing with CWD management is trying to, this is a very technical term, but overcome the force of infection. And that really is the frequency of the population is becoming infected in a new year, right? And removing deer quicker, more deer than can be infected, right? So it becomes a proportions game. And so really the goal is to remove enough fast enough that you don't allow spread to continue. Mm-hmm. Because we know it's not necessary. The higher the density, the more challenging that is. I think, right, you have larger numbers of deer on the landscape. Because we have to recognize that CWD is present in some very low density populations. I mean, parts of the West, those are very low density populations. The diseases there is at a very high rate. So the question's really more, I think, and from a long-term standpoint, is what proportion of the population are we removing on an annual basis? And what composition of that population should we be removing? So it morphs into this something that's a little more simple than saying, hey, we got 40 deer per square mile. We need to have 25 deer per square mile. Well, I think it really probably at the end of the day, we talk about long-term management. It's going to be about how quickly are we turning that population over? Are we removing enough that we're removing enough infected deer from the population that we're not allowing prevalence to increase? Mm. So it becomes this measure of antlerless harvest making up, a lot of our counties, 25%, right? That's sort of this gold standard sort of number that's been thrown out there. If we can remove 25% of the adult females, we've got a stable population. Mm. We got to think about the prevalence of CWD in that context too. Sure. It may mean that we need to harvest a little higher or a little different in terms of where the disease is and how quick we can turn that population over.
Seems like it's a condition of like ripping the Band-Aid off very quickly and just being done with it, or jumping into a cold pool as opposed to wading in. But guys, we probably wouldn't be doing our jobs if we didn't ask, because one of the major accusations we see online are that state game agencies are collaborating with insurance companies to reduce the number of deer out there, reducing the number of auto collisions, reducing the number of claims. Is there any merit to that?
I can say in the 16 years that I worked for the Missouri Department of Conservation, I don't believe that I've received a letter or a phone call from an insurance agency lobbying us to reduce deer densities. They understand the risk, I think, and pass that on to their insurance policy holders. So not to say it doesn't happen. I'm sure it does. But I think part of it too here is we have always had in Missouri healthy and robust populations, but in many cases ones that are pretty well in balance with the public's tolerance of them, which sort of then mitigates some of the concerns around deer vehicle collisions.
Some of us would have preferred just to hit a deer last year so they would have got one.
Tim, I mean,
we're just speaking in generalities here.
All right. So one thing on areas that have these CWD positive, counties that have CWD positives, if you are in a mitigation area in that 2 mile radius and you decide, yes, I'm going to go and try to control the herd population on behalf of the Missouri Department of Conservation, instead of having some group come in and do it for me. I think I know my land, I know my herd, I'm going to do it. How do those people then have to handle the carcasses after they've, done the mitigation? Like, what happens to the deer so that you don't make matters worse and spread it? What happens after you shoot the deer?
Yeah, so those landowners, and many of them do choose to harvest deer themselves during that target removal period. And so we've got a network of landowners that we work with. They'll simply give us a call when they harvest a deer. Our staff will go pick up the deer, sample the deer. We'll also have the deer processed. And then for those landowners that desire to consume the meat, if we get a not detected result, the meat will be delivered back to the landowners for their consumption. If it tests positive, of course, it'll be properly disposed of. So we really have a pretty extensive program with all the staff that we have that work very closely with the landowners, try to make it as convenient as possible for them to participate and as easy as possible to help us achieve our goals. But in terms of just generally speaking about, proper disposal of deer carcasses, our recommendation is to dispose of it in the trash so it ends up in a landfill. That way it's not out there on the landscape. If folks kind of the second level recommendation, if that one can't be satisfied, is to, if they have the ability to do so, bury the carcass. A lot of folks don't have that ability. If they don't have that ability, at least leave the carcass on the harvest property. That way, if the deer ends up testing positive, there's more than likely was another positive deer there. And so you'd be much less risk to that population rather than taking a carcass somewhere else and disposing it somewhere else and then potentially spreading the disease that way.
Have you guys found many issues as it pertains to like going to a processor, say a positive CWD positive deer made its way to a processor unbeknownst to the hunter? Does it then infect the meat there at the processor? That's not how it works, right? Or is it?
Yeah, so that's been one of those questions, and certainly one that pretty early on processors were somewhat concerned about some of their liability and responsibility if they did in fact process a CWD positive deer and went through their facility. I think, most of them, are doing, they're deboning pretty fast. The practices of sawing through the bones and all those kinds of things have kind of a practice of the past, right? So a lot of deboning, which again minimizes the likelihood of having a large number of prions. So they're doing a good job of removing a lot of lymphatic tissue from the carcass itself. There's probably not a lot there, but the reality is, there's CWD deer going through those facilities. But I think through common cleaning practices that many of them are doing and routinely do, they're then just further minimizing the likelihood of prions being transferred. But I don't, unless they're cleaning everything after every individual deer, I think the steps that most take in a pretty clean operation are minimizing a lot of that.
And how long does it take for someone to get a result on their deer once they're tested?
Yeah, so it depends a little bit on the time of year. Our busiest time of year would be obviously opening weekend on the November portion, where we're collecting about 20,000 samples. But even with running 20,000 samples through the lab, we're getting last year more than 90% of the results back within a 10-day window. So reasonably quick considering the number of samples. If you harvest it at another time of the season, a non-peak time of season, you get it even quicker than that.
Oh, okay.
All right.
A lot of times transportation is the biggest time delay. Getting the sample from where it was collected to the lab itself is probably the logistic challenge that we have. But yeah, there's been massive improvements in terms of turnaround time.
Great.
Anything, I'm sure there's a ton of topics related to CWD that we haven't gone down. But is there anything major that we've missed here that you guys want to share before we I would want to jump into some of the firearm season changes before we move on.
I guess, Matt, I would say we're trying to reframe this conversation. I think to this point, CWD has been this thing that we can all agree that we hate. But it also leads to these conversations that just feel like negatives, right? Like, well, we're taking away the antler point restriction, or, oh, well, we're taking away, feeding and taking away placement of minerals. And, oh, yeah, by the way, you got these complicated carcass movement regulations you have to deal with. And, oh, yeah, by the way, on opening weekend, you got to bring your deer and get it right. It feels just very negative. We're going to come in and do additional, winter removals. And it takes this context of negativity, and I think creates a little bit of divisiveness around the issue. So what we're hoping to have and move forward with is a much more, again, the disease is nasty, but much more positive conversation around what is it going to take for us all to come to our shared purpose and understanding that we care about the health of whitetail deer population. How do we best move forward in accomplishing that? I don't think anybody believes today that CWD is going to make populations go extinct. Is it going to make them less resilient? Absolutely. 100%. There's no doubt about that. How can we proactively and aggressively manage a whitetail deer population in the presence of CWD that hopefully results in some of the outcomes that we want, which is this long-term sustainable opportunity to harvest a majestic animal that provides, millions of pounds of fresh venison on the plates of many, many people, that we get to carry out our hunting heritage by sharing that meat, right? I mean, that's what we're talking about. How do we sustain this critter that means so much to so many of us? Recognizing that there are going to be some trade-offs to doing that. And so what does that look like? How do we have a constructive conversation about how we move forward instead of what feels like just an adversarial, hey, I'm dug in and I'm protecting this thing that I care about, regardless of the outcome. And Jason and I and everybody else in this room are as passionate about deer and deer hunting as anybody else, right? And want nothing but the best outcome for this critter. And so how do we have and start to have a constructive conversation around conservation and management of whitetail deer instead of what feels like using CWD to fight over some really challenging issues, no doubt.
And I get it. I totally get it from both sides, from the MDC side of trying to do what's best for the resource, but from the hunter's angle of it feels like, we're trying to decimate the Missouri herd. That's what you generally see online and hear, in the coffee shops is like, man, they're just trying to kill them all, because you go through the firearm seasons and, if you're in a CWD area, I think is it something like 43 days where you can harvest a whitetail with a firearm in hand, and in 38 days, I think if my math was right, which could be wrong, if you're not a CWD county. So I think those are the things that it's a tough, you're going to have a tough battle there because general population and what they feel like is being done versus behind closed doors, the research and the time and the effort and, what you guys are feeling like is you're doing best for the resource. It's just so on opposite ends of the spectrum. And I think you really have a tough job ahead of you to try to bring people towards the middle. It's about like politics right now. It's just really hard to bring people towards the middle and have a conversation about it because there's just a lot of divisiveness behind it. And, that's kind of why we wanted to have you guys on, just so you could we could try to ask some tough questions and you guys could say, okay, here's why we are doing what we're doing. And some people aren't going to believe you no matter what. Some people are probably on the fence and say, okay, this does make sense. I understand it. And we're probably trying to, reach a little bit of all, right?
Yep. Yeah. And just to open it up and have the conversation. That's important.
So real quick on the firearm season side of it, I did want to touch on that. So what's the thought process behind some of the extended seasons or change it, even like youth season? I think it changed. Wasn't it always the last weekend of October? Now it's the first weekend of November. Like what are some of the thought process behind the changes that we're seeing in this year's regs?
Yeah. So the timing of the youth portions did not change this year. That's based on formula. In terms of the new season portion. So last year we had a new early antlerless firearms portion in October, and we had what we call our CWD portion, 5-day portion right on the tail end of the November portion, the CWD management zone. And really there's a couple objectives of those new portions, but really, I mean, if you made a comment about deer numbers in general, Matt, I mean, throughout the state, if we look at our deer hunter surveys, most hunters in most places are very satisfied with deer numbers. We've got a healthy deer population. Deer population continues to increase. And so we're trying to get hunters to harvest more antlerless deer to stabilize those numbers before they reach levels where, they become a real issue in terms of deer vehicle collisions, damage to agricultural crops. And so, there's several other states that have an early antlerless portion of firearm season. And so we did a survey. We had majority support on our survey for establishing such a season, and provides a unique opportunity for folks to go out with a firearm early in the season before the November portion, where a lot of them are focusing on harvesting a buck, to harvest an antlerless deer or two for the freezer, and saw a nice harvest of over 16,000 deer during that 3-day portion last year. So that was great to see. And then with the CWD portion, just giving folks in the CWD management zone counties more hunting opportunity at a really great time of year to be in the woods. So that extra 5 days harvested just over 11,000 deer during that season portion. So again, a lot of our populations, even in the management zone, are increasing. So we wanted to give folks that extra opportunity in those counties to harvest some additional deer. But certainly the objective, obviously, is not to cause dramatic reductions in our deer population. Is trying to provide more opportunity for folks to shoot more antlerless deer at a time when we seem to be seeing shifting preferences and more hunters interested in harvesting antlered deer and less interested in harvesting antlerless deer. And I think it was really effective last year. Our antlerless harvest increased quite substantially from the year before. And so I was real pleased with the results of those 2 new portions.
Heck yeah.
Do you think...
Man, I would say one thing about this year's one of those years where you mentioned that the youth looks like the youth portion early youth is in November. We have, the season, the firearms portion can be as early as the 10th and as late as the 16th.
Yeah.
So this is one of those years where it shifts back to the 16th. And so folks, if they're not paying attention to the calendar, might go a weekend early, which we hope they don't do.
Yeah.
But the result is that that youth portion then ends up the 2nd and 3rd of November.
Gotcha. That's part of that formula you were talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah, I did notice that the firearm season, the main firearm seasons was kind of a little further back than it had been the last couple of seasons. So do you guys, one of the comments I often hear about the firearm seasons, the antlerless seasons, or the youth seasons is like, oh, a lot of dads are going to, kill them a buck this weekend, or the antlerless season gives a poacher a chance to kill a buck. Like, how often does that really happen? I mean, is that really an issue? I've never, obviously, I mean, you're not probably going to know about it, but I've never heard of that ever happening. I'm sure it may go on, but is that really a epidemic we have going on in the Missouri woods?
We hear that too. We hear about youth turkey season, right? It's the source of the decline of the turkey population because all the dads are out there shooting turkeys for their kids. And I guess I don't really enjoy playing those games of demonizing the hunting public, which is basically what they're doing. They're casting aspersions on our hunting public, and I don't believe that's the case, right? Do folks engage in illegal activity during the hunting season? Yes. Have they always engaged in illegal activity during the hunting season? Yes. Does allowing youth the opportunity to go out there and chase deer for an extra weekend put at risk our deer population? No, it's giving future generations an additional opportunity. And so, yeah, it happens. There's no doubt it happens, but I do not believe it is, this substantial percentage that would suggest we should then do away with it, right? That's basically what they're arguing is, well, it's so bad we should do away with it. And we just don't have any evidence that would suggest that is the case.
I've always felt like the worst penalty for a person who does that is that they just continue to be that type of person for the rest of their life. You may get pinched, you may not, but you will still be that person.
Well, I'm sure you're in the same boat with your kids. I am with mine. Cameron's already talking about youth season. He's pumped for it, and he's not an excited kid about much of anything. And this weekend we were with mom and dad. And he was talking with dad about coming up to the farm and cool. He's excited about it. And I think that's really the purpose behind these seasons. So, it's probably by and large doing what it's supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
Tim, anything else to add on your end?
You guys want to grill us on hunting tips or anything? Or
any questions about how to brush hog? Ask him.
Yeah, what things should we avoid doing? Right?
Don't do what Donnie Don't does.
Well, you're already on the podcast, so you screwed up. You're already one notch down.
No, I sincerely thank you guys for giving us the opportunity. It's CWD and deer management is it's a challenging topic, and it's one that everybody has an opinion on, right? We're trying to do our level best to ground decisions and things that we move forward in good solid data and reasoning, and then also informing and being informed by the hunting public, right? I mean, we need to continue to engage with our hunters in terms of how we're going to go about managing this really iconic species. And so I hope, if nothing else, we come across as a little bit reasonable and not pinheaded bureaucrats that make decisions that don't have any idea as to what's going on. And I appreciate you guys giving us a few minutes to share a little bit about what we're thinking and why we've been doing what we've been doing.
Heck yeah. And regardless of your titles, you guys are both deer hunters. So, when you're talking shop with guys who are also hunters, we know at the core, we all have this very precious resource that we all care very much about. So it's nice to be able to kind of connect at that level too.
All right, guys. Well, that's all I have on my end. I'm sure there's, several questions that we probably should have asked that we haven't. We'll see that in the comments section.
We'll see them.
And we'll just have to have you guys back on, and hopefully sooner than 6 years.
Always happy to do it, fellas.
All right. We appreciate both your time.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah. Thanks, Jason and Jason. And, I think that's all I got for today's episode. How about you?
Yeah, be sure to tune in next week because we're inching closer to episode 400. We got to do something for that.
Well, yeah. I guess we just planned it right now.
Hey, let's.
All right. Well, that's all I got. Until next time, we appreciate y'all. Be careful in the woods and peace out.
See ya.
Take land management to the next level with DeerCast's exclusive virtual rain gauges. Pinpoint accuracy and historical data, all powered by industry-leading ag weather services. DeerCast has the tools to keep you ahead of your game. We're adding new videos every week, so make sure to click that subscribe button and check out all of our amazing content. This episode of DoD TV is brought to you by DeerCast Maps, waypoints, weather, virtual rain gauges, and more. Every tool you need to get ahead of your game.